Greetings from Totnes in Devon, everybody. My name's Rob Hopkins. I'm really thrilled to have been asked to speak to your conference today. This has been the wettest June on record and looks set to be the wettest July on record, and I was quite taken with the logo for your conference and actually how many parts of England over the last couple of weeks have actually looked like that. And in fact my garden at the moment is looking quite like that. I have slugs the size of puppies crashing about, laying waste to all my lovingly grown local food. There's certainly not a great deal of food resilience coming out of my garden at the moment. Unless I can learn to develop a taste for slugs, unfortunately. But I'm really thrilled to have been asked to speak to this conference today. Looking through the list of people who are speaking, it's certainly many of those who have really inspired the work that I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years, and so I'm really honoured to be speaking in their company. I'm sorry not to be there in person. I gave a pledge about 5 or 6 years ago to stop flying, and I stick to that very tightly. And I worked out, thanks to a website online somewhere, that by not flying to be with you in person, I've saved 3.82 tons of carbon dioxide, which is about half of my annual use of carbon, and it would rather kind of make irrelevant all the other changes that I try and do in my life. So I hope you can appreciate why I've chosen not to actually be there in person, but I hope that nonetheless this will be a useful contribution to the Building Green Communities annual conference, which looks like a fabulous event. So I've been asked to speak a bit about transition, which is the side of all of this that I've been involved in, and it was kind of my response after going through the kind of peak oil, climate change, dark night of the soul that I'm sure many of you have experienced as well, or if you haven't, you probably will have by the end of this conference. So the idea was really to design an experiment which was bottom-up, which was self-organising, which was driven by people on the ground, which was looking at the possibilities that are presented by the times rather than the probabilities. So where can we go from here? What, if we apply our collective genius to this challenge, could we actually maybe pull out of this and create from it? So it's really been a 6-year experiment. You know, transition isn't a model, it isn't a theory, it isn't an analysis particularly. It's an experiment. And when I first kicked it off here in Totnes in 2005, I imagined that it was an environmental process. But really now, 5 or 6 years on, it feels very much like a cultural process. How do we start to influence and nudge and cajole and invite the culture of a place to make itself more prepared, more resilient for times of rapid change, and to see that as an opportunity for all manner of creativity and inventiveness and entrepreneurship, and that's really what we've started to see in transition. So there are now thousands of transition initiatives in 34 countries around the world. And very often people come to us at Transition Network and say, oh, it's so amazing what's happening, what Transition Network's doing, there's this and there's that. And we don't do that stuff. You know, that stuff is people like yourselves out on the ground in their communities getting on with it. Our role really is just to provide training and support and to tell those stories, to share those stories. So what I want to do today is really to tell you a couple of the stories of things that are happening. And then I want to focus in on the story of what's happening here in Totnes, the rather soggy Totnes that I'm speaking to you from today, because I think there's a very interesting story starting to unfold here as well. So transition groups have been active now in different parts of the world for 5 or 6 years. As I say, in a very self-organising, bottom-up way. They don't get a list from Transition Network of first you do this and then you do this. The idea is very much that it's like selecting the ingredients from a pantry and cooking the most beautiful dish, the most locally appropriate dish that you can. So we have things like the Bristol Pound, which is about to launch in September, a very interesting local currency scheme, the first one for a whole city in the UK, a complementary currency with both printed notes and a system whereby you can pay by text. You walk in the shop, you text the shopkeeper, transaction done. Hundreds of local traders now signed up for the scheme. You'll be able to also pay your council tax. Businesses will be able to pay their rates to the council using it. And it's of a scale where it could potentially be a real game changer in terms of how cities think about their economies. Bath and West Community Energy, a local energy company that emerged out of Transition Bath, is up and running now, and with a very interesting model, which means that it gives people the confidence to shift their pensions into local energy generation. They have a goal of putting about £11 million worth of renewable energy in place within 5 years, and they're very much on the path to doing that. We have communities who are buying and setting up their own shops, their own bakeries, their own breweries. It's very, very exciting to see the kind of innovation and entrepreneurship that emerges out of just asking that question: how would this place function if oil cost $200 a barrel, or if the cash machines stop working? Rather than everybody heading for the hills with a shotgun and 4 years worth of toilet paper and baked beans, actually what we see through the transition lens is a coming together, is a constructive, creative process which is thrilled by the possibilities that are inherent in the challenge that we face. One of the things that's emerged out of transition, which I'd like to share with you here, some of you who are already involved in it might find it useful, and some of you who aren't might find it an interesting insight into transition, is something that's been developed through the Transition Thrive training, which is a course that's been created for groups who are a couple of years into doing transition, and maybe it's going really well, or maybe it's got a bit stuck, or maybe they run out of energy a little bit, but they feel they need a bit of a boost or a bit of a reflection. So Transition Thrive is really designed for that. So one of the things they have, they call the dognostic. And a dognostic is a way of looking to see how your group is doing, and maybe why it might not be moving as it could be. So like a dog, it has 4 legs and a tail and a head. And so these 4 legs are networks and partnerships is the first one. So how well is your transition initiative rooted in the community? How has it built partnerships with other local organisations rather than just being quite insular and just talking to itself? The second one is awareness raising, the need for transition groups to be building awareness about climate change, the impact of what's happening economically, peak oil, these kind of things, that awareness raising runs through its events and is a continual part of its work. The third of its legs is about the groups and about paying attention to how the group works, making sure that it's got good communication, that it understands how it works, and that some time is given over to that whole issue of how the transition initiative will work as a group. And then the last of those 4 legs is projects, practical projects, reskilling, actually doing something, that thrill of creating something with other people, taking that step across into actually making things happen. So our dog needs these 4 legs, our transition initiative, transition dog, needs these 4 legs in order to be able to move around and to be able to do stuff. If you take one away, it can kind of limp along, but it's not really going to be doing everything that it should be. The tail then is that check. Well, is the tail wagging? Is this a happy creature? In terms of looking at how healthy the group is as a whole. And then the head is the vision, the looking forward. Is it looking forward and thinking about where it's going? Does it have a vision and a story that is propelling it forward? And lots of groups are finding that a really useful kind of way at looking at maybe where they've got stuck, maybe where things aren't working as well as they can be. So what we found, particularly here in Totnes, was that we started the first 2 or 3 years really just talking about transition in context of peak oil, climate change. That's what we're about. We are a community response to peak oil and climate change. That led to the flowering of all kinds of different projects, all kinds of different initiatives, a lot of people getting involved. But after about 3 years, we started to shift that discussion slightly to being about how do we create a new economy for this place? How do we take all these ideas that are emerging about how this place would be as a more resilient, post-carbon, more localised economy, and actually translate them into active enterprises happening on the ground? And that actually proved to be a much bigger shift than we had anticipated. So Totnes is the first transition initiative in the UK, and So I want to talk a little bit more about it, because I think the story of what's emerging here is actually really interesting and really exciting. So when we made that shift in terms of how we talked about it, all of a sudden loads of new people started getting involved who hadn't really been involved before. People came who'd almost been sort of sitting on the fence, just kind of keeping an eye on it, waiting for the language to change. I think it was interesting as well, because there were people who when you just talk about peak oil and climate change all the time, you get up to all the people who agree with that, but then there are lots of people who are very entrenched. Oh, I don't believe in climate change. Some transition sounds interesting, but I'm not really interested in climate change. So now there are projects underway where the people get involved because it's a great project, whether they believe in climate change or not. What we've been looking at really is the creation of a new economy. And I know there's some great stuff happening in the States through some of the work, the pioneering work from Willits, and the work that Ballet, B-A-L-L-E, I never quite know how you say it, is it Ballet or Ballet? Anyway, and Michael Schumann, and these various things that are really emerging, looking at how you stimulate a local economy, and which have been a great inspiration to us here. And so for us, when we look at a local economy for here, we have 6 kind of criteria that we're really trying to use to underpin this idea of a transition economy. The first is whether it builds resilience, that ability to withstand shock. How does it make this community, this local economy, more resilient, more flexible, with greater bounce back ability as we enter times where it's being buffeted around more? Is it low carbon? Are the businesses that we put in place dependent on imports over long distances, or are they actually designed from the beginning to be low carbon in terms of the materials they use, how the product is used, how it's disposed of, how people interact with it, and so on? The third one is, does it respect natural limits? Does it sit within the idea that we need to be living within kind of a one planet footprint, if you like? Does it respect the limits to growth approach, which is being so necessarily celebrated at the event? Does it build localization? Does it support the whole wider process of intentional localization? Does it sit within a kind of a better thought through, designed process of localizing the economy? Is it not just for personal profit? It's not to say that profit isn't a motivation and that things shouldn't be profitable, but is it something which maybe is run as a cooperative? Is it something which is run as a profit-making enterprise, but with a bigger social agenda that has some wider purpose to what it's doing? And lastly, does it bring assets into community ownership? Does it set projects up which return certain assets into community ownership for the long-term benefit, and moving as far as we can away from how things are working at the moment, where you can think of many industries really as being an extractive industry. Many shops like Walmart and big chains that move into communities really operate as an extractive industry, and how can we come up with a different approach? So here in Totnes, we started Transition Town Totnes 2005, 2006. And as I say, the first 3 years or so were really focused on peak oil climate change, starting a range of projects such as Garden Share, where we match up people who want to grow food with people who have gardens that they don't want to use. The Totnes Pound, a kind of experimental local currency scheme here, planting fruits and nut trees throughout the town. There are now 200 or 300 trees planted in different parts of the town. A whole range of those kind of projects of people coming together and just kicking things off that they're really passionate about. But what we've been doing over the last year or so, I think is really, really interesting. So one of those is called an economic blueprint. And if a supermarket, for example, wanted to open up here in this town, they would be able to produce their case would be, we will create this number of jobs, we'll bring this much money to the local economy. But usually those of us who argue that we need to localize our economies and make them more resilient, we don't do that. We tend to say, we should localize our local economy because it's a good idea. It's somehow morally superior. It's a better approach. But we don't generally tend to argue it in terms of economics in that way. Put a value to it. What's the size of the prize of localizing? So the economic blueprint is one of the first things I've ever seen which kind of tries to map our local economy, and it's happening here in Totnes and in Hereford and in the city of Manchester as well. So how much money do we spend on food? Where does that money go? What is the makeup of the local economy? How much money do we spend on energy every year? How much of that money could we keep locally? How much do we spend on heating our homes that is just wasted through uninsulated roofs? What's the potential to the local economy of a concerted effort at insulating those houses? How much money do we spend on care every year for the elderly? How much of that could be kept locally? And it's been absolutely fascinating. So we find, for example, that about 80% of the £30 million that we spend on food every year goes out through just 2 supermarkets. And Totnes has a much stronger local food economy than many other places, but most of that money just goes out through supermarkets. So you start to be able to argue then that actually if we could just take 10% of money that's spent on food, that's about £1 million, £2 million in the local economy. At a time when our local politicians are going, how are we going to bring money into the local economy? You know, it's sort of being hit by all the economic troubles that we're experiencing. Well, maybe one way is just by shifting what we already do, plugging the leaks in the local economy in that sense. So it's been being a very useful process, but also what's been great about it is that it's being done in partnership with the town council, the district council, the local colleges, the local chamber of commerce are all on board as part of this process of mapping the economy. So we're starting to build an economic case for localisation, which is really important, really exciting. Running alongside that is also a campaign to stop a big coffee chain who want to open here. We have 25 independent coffee businesses in Totnes, and we recently just held an independent coffee festival to celebrate that, where we had a barista competition and all kinds of events celebrating that very valuable, that very precious culture that we have here of local independent coffee businesses. Also partly as a way of showing our opposition to this coffee chain that wants to come in. So I think that juxtaposition of creating a new economy alongside trying to protect the vulnerable, fragile economy that we already have is really important. Another part of that is around how do we stimulate new businesses, new entrepreneurs to come forward to help create this more local, more resilient economy. So one of the things we did recently was a local entrepreneurs forum where we brought together people who were local entrepreneurs with people who had ideas. And it was a kind of a networking day where people could get to meet people who had ideas, people who could mentor, people who had experience running businesses, and also people who were potential investors. And quite a few businesses got matched up with people who wanted to invest in making them happen. And we also held a Green Dragon's Den where people pitched their business ideas to 3 green dragons on the stage, and really starting to build it. That'll become an annual event as a way of starting to get people really focused on that. Already through Transition Town Totnes, we're starting to see some really good social enterprises emerging which are designed to support the wider work of Transition Town Totnes. So one of those is transition tours, because so many people come to visit Totnes to find out about transition, and it can become a bit of a strain for the central organisation when 20 people from Korea turn up wanting a tour of the town without even having told anyone that they were coming. Seems amazing you'd come all the way from Korea without letting somebody know that you were coming and would like that kind of service. So it's set up as a social enterprise, and it provides a fantastic experience for people who come to visit the town. We've seen the setting up of the Totnes Sustainable Construction Company, a local building firm which is focusing on, at the moment, on the retrofitting of existing buildings, which is also retraining and reskilling people in terms of how to do that. One of the most interesting things that we did recently was called Transition Streets. And Transition Streets was a project that we got some government funding for, but which was about what behaviour change looks like on a street-by-street level. So what it did was it provided like a workbook, so with 7 sessions, And the idea was to get out on your street, knock on the doors, get a group of 6 to 10 neighbours together, and then meet in each other's houses and work through the workbook. And at the end of each session, there are some things you can do before you meet up next time. And on average, each household that gets involved cuts its carbon by about 1.3 tonnes, saves itself about £600 a year. But what's really exciting about it is that when I meet people in the street, they don't say, "Oh, it's great, I was involved in transition streets, I've saved £600 or cut my carbon by whatever." What they say is, "It's great, I now know Dave over the road, I know Sandra down here, whatever." And when we did a survey, a very detailed survey at the end of Transition Streets, actually the main thing that came through when they were asked, why did you get involved with this, what did you get out of it, was about meeting neighbours. Nobody talked about climate change, nobody talked about peak oil, everybody talked about community, neighbours, getting to know everybody better. And it almost feels to me like when we're thinking about how we deal with peak oil and climate change, that shift away from explicitly this is what we're doing, to building community in such a way that the actions, the resilience building almost happens by accident, is one of the key sort of insights for me from 5 years of this experiment. It's a bit like when you go into a room in the dark, when you have a power cut, you go into a room and you need to find your car keys that you've left lying on the floor. And if you just look straight at things in the dark, you can't actually see them. When you're looking for something in a dark room, but when you look slightly to the side, actually you see them out of the corner of your vision rather than when you look at them straight. And so in a sense that transition, I think, has maybe shifted its focus from looking for things directly to shifting slightly to the side where you can actually see things better in that way. So Transition Streets has been fantastic. Over 650 households in Totnes have now done this, and it's built a very interesting sort of community of people who've been doing that, and it's now being rolled out in a whole range of other places. I think Transition US are also taking Transition Streets and creating a US version of it. One of the bits of Transition Town Totnes that I've been most involved with, which is very exciting, is the Atmos project. So Atmos is about taking an 8-acre derelict site in the middle of town, right next to the railway station, which used to be a milk processing factory, and which closed down 5 years ago with a loss of 165 jobs. It's about taking that site into community ownership and developing it as a catalyst for a transition economy for the town, with a work hub where people can come with their ideas for a transition business and have it supported through to its realisation, where there's office space for all kinds of enterprises built around those 6 qualities of economic localisation I described earlier on. Where there is a school for food entrepreneurs, where there's a bakery and a brewery and cheese making which run commercially, but also where people can come and visit, where an old listed building that's already there is done up as a public space, where there's a hostel for people to come and visit, where there's affordable housing built as self-build. And one of the things that we want to do there, in the same way now that when people open a restaurant they want to be a local, green, ethical restaurant, they maybe say we will source 80% local materials. We're going to state from the outset that we want this development to be built using 80 or 90% local materials, and see where that takes us in terms of the training and the facilities that then makes available for that project. This project's been running for about 5 years and has done lots of work, but has always been hamstrung by the fact that the people who own the site won't engage with us. They've convinced themselves they could sell it to a developer for lots of money. So we recently launched a big campaign which is called Atmos, the Heart of the New Economy, which has been about trying to put enough pressure on the site's owners to get them to actually engage with us and work with us. And it's been running for about 3 months, and this logo has appeared all over town. We've done loads and loads of interviews with local people and taken their photo all holding this, badges, everything. And it looks like we're nearly there in terms of pushing the site's owner into working with us. And I think then that becomes a real game changer. It's a step up in terms of ambition about economic localization. And one of the things that I think it does, which being involved with Atmos has really driven home to me, is that actually quite often it's the people who are involved with localization and trying to make it happen can often be the people who have an inbuilt belief that they need to work at it, but it's never really actually going to happen. You know, I think we need, those of us in this movement need some really good success stories that help support and underpin the whole thing. You know, I talk to some people in the town here and they go, well, it's a nice idea, but it's never going to happen. But actually, I think once we get to create a new model of how development can happen, again, because development is another extractive industry, sucking money out of our communities and taking it away to other places, then I think things start to change. So I hope that's been an interesting sort of whiz through some of the stuff that's happening in transition, both nationally here in the UK, but also in terms of what's happening here in Totnes. I think for me, one of the key things about transition has always been that inbuilt kind of humility, that sense of being able to say, I don't know. You know, that actually we learn by coming together and doing it. And so when we were researching the Transition Companion, the most recent book about transition, it was very much based on going out to everybody and saying, what are you doing? What works? What doesn't work? How's it going? And realising that actually the model that we'd so carefully set out in the Transition Handbook of the 12 steps, first you do this, then you do this, then you do this, actually none of them were doing that at all. They'd say, well, we did the first one, and then we did the second one, then we didn't like the third one, and then we made up our own one then to go in there, and then we did the 12th one, and then we did the 7th one, and then we didn't do any of the others. Or other people would say, well, we started doing the first, and then the second, and then the third, and then it wasn't really working, and you know, but actually what we found was that people were rather assembling different things, different ingredients, if you like, in different ways to create a transition that was place appropriate. So that transition in the favelas in Sao Paulo in Brazil, or transition in Brixton, or transition in Bologna in Italy, all look different because they're assembled appropriately to the culture in a way that a top-down model could never ever do. And that's where the inventiveness and the creativity and the brilliance, I think, of it is. And so our role in Transition Network is really to pull all that stuff together, to tell those stories, and to kind of, you know, keep a flavour of what transition is about in that sense. But that sort of self-organising sense of it all, I think, is really exciting and really exhilarating. So a little while ago I heard an interview with the Dalai Lama on the radio, and he was asked about Tibet and if he thought he'd ever go back to Tibet, you know, which to anybody else looking at it is just never going to happen. You know, the kind of the politics of it is such that that's never going to happen. It would seem like a completely unattainable task. And he said, why not? In his very sort of jolly sort of way, why not? And it actually struck me that phrase, why not, is actually really useful, you know, because it's about possibilities. Anything is possible moving forward from this point in time. It's whether we decide to put our energy into that and exploring those possibilities. And I think in many ways, why not, is actually a far more useful saying than we are the 99% or something. You know, well, why not? You know, we can do extraordinary stuff. When we started doing transition, if people had said, you know, in 5 years' time there'll be this, there'll be that, there'll be thousands of groups around the world looking at this in their communities, they'll be setting up their own banks, their own currencies, their own energy companies, their own food systems, their own enterprises, they'll be working with their local councils, you know, they'll be getting funding from different organisations, they'll be, you know, I would never have entertained that even as likely, but here we are. And these extraordinary times demand an extraordinary response, and so for me, I think, why not? You know, where do we go from here? I have no idea, but I think there's some very exciting groundwork being laid by transition initiatives, and also many other exciting organisations who are focusing on this whole question of how do we build economic resilience, how do we build economic localisation, of which many of you are part. So I feel really honoured and really humbled to be part of this exhilarating movement that's gaining pace around the world, and all the ingenuity that you all bring to this. And maybe that's my closing thought to leave you with as you go on to enjoy the rest of your event, which I wish I was there at myself. Why not?